Today we're going to be in Luke 16. We're looking at the parable of the shrewd manager, another parable about money. Jesus told, he taught a lot about money. And we've been talking about it for a few weeks in these parables of the tenants, the parable of the miners.
Where is that?
Luke 16. And I was reading a book that I had just bought, and I read a few pages of it actually, but it said that it made a comment that the New Testament is about 1/3 parables. I was like, wow. But this is our 53rd week, so, or 54th.
Where are we at?
Luke 16, the parable of the shrewd manager. This is a parable. When we were doing these parables in Luke, like Luke 15 and all those, we've done a lot of them there, but I skipped over this one to wait and do it with the tenants, the parable of the talents, and the parable of the minas, and then the sheep and goats. That'll come into focus again today as we look at this parable of the shrewd manager. It's sort of a simple message, but it's maybe hard to come by a little bit. But we're gonna read it, and I want you to read through we're gonna read the parable, verse 16, chapter 16, verse 1 to 8. And I don't want you to look ahead past that. Jesus talks about it and helps us to understand it, but I want to read it that far. Then I want to see what you can come up with in this parable. And we'll start with Jerry. 16:1.
And he said also unto his disciples, there was a certain rich man, and he had a steward, and the same was accused unto him that he had wasted his goods.
And he called him and said unto him, how is it that I hear this of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest be no longer steward.
The manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg.
I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes.
So he called every one of his lord's debtors unto him, and said unto the first, how much owest thou unto my lord?
And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50.
And how much do you owe my employer? He asked the next man. I owe him 1,000 bushels of wheat, was the reply. Here, the manager said, take the bill and change it to 800 bushels.
The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. Now, Jesus goes on, we're going to look at that, his comments on that. But when we read just that parable, what kind of lesson do you see in it? You've done this quite a bit, and you've almost always come up with...
Well, he's definitely dishonest, because he's changing what the bill is. He's a dishonest person.
So who's he cheating?
Shrewd.
Who's he cheating?
Him, well, there's
He's cheating his master, isn't he?
Yeah,
He's looking out for himself.
sure.
Okay. Do you think that's one of the lessons that we should draw from the parable? To look out for ourselves?
Not to. I mean, you look out for others. He should be responsible to his employer, I would think.
I have read done research with the Jesus films, if you remember them way back. And I looked at it last night as I was going through some websites and just reading comments. Listen to what they said. He commended, verse 8, he commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. And this says, like the people in his parable, Jesus encourages his followers to look out for themselves. But he's encouraging them to think long-term, to store up treasures in heaven. He's encouraging us to use our finances in a way that God enthusiastically welcomes us as a good and faithful servant. I like most of that. But think of the lessons that we've just done, and we're going to review a couple of those things today. But how about that comment about he's trying to get people to look out for
Well,
themselves?
there are times when we need to look out for ourselves, like, it depends on the situation, like you said, to store up treasures in heaven and to think about our eternal, what we're trying to build for eternity. Absolutely, we need to be concerned about what we do. But as far as cheating our brothers and sisters here on earth, no.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to understand that, but there's a lesson. There's a lesson that we'll see develop.
It looks like,
I wanted to point that out.
I was
We're going to
thinking,
talk about it again.
he was like trying to, like, he didn't want to lose his job. So he was trying to find a way to keep his job so that he didn't know what to do. So he said, I think he was trying to barter, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so you owe me a big amount, but make it smaller, you know what I mean? So he was trying to,
He was trying to make. Go ahead, Joseph.
I always had a hard time understanding this until a few years ago there was a big scandal of corruption in Brazil, really big, that was discovered. And really, the biggest one in the history of the country, billions and billions. So what happened, this judge, he did special deals with the people, like you return the money, part of the money you stole, and also you will tell us, you disclose everything. So yeah, they cut a deal with the major corrupt people. And then when I was reading some of the commentaries, that probably something similar is what Jesus is talking about. That actually what he's doing, he's getting the money that he stole from his master, and he is actually paying himself with the money he stole, the debt of the other people, so he will be in favor. Because I always thought he was actually stealing more money from the master, and the master was saying, "Oh, how wonderful you are, stealing more money." But they said one of the possibilities that he actually was getting what he stole from his master now, and he was deducting the debt of the other people with the money that he got. So he is getting a better place for himself using the resources that he got dishonest. And that made sense what was going on in my country at the moment, because that was just, in the end it was justice, because those people were giving back the money they stole, and they were making a deal to actually bring proofs and be able to show actually what was going on in the country. So a lot of justice was done. And I said, I think it makes sense of the parable now.
Yeah, and it sort of makes sense in the world too. I mean, that's how people do things sometimes in the world.
Right.
But the problem a lot of people have with this parable is that Jesus commended a crook.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what we get hung up on, I think, most of it. And there's a good explanation for that. But before we get into it much, any other thoughts initially on what kind of any lesson that we could pull from this, just from what we know?
like, we were just talking about that in the car on the way over here, like, people of the world are more shrewd than people of God. God doesn't want us to be stupid, you know, as I walk out in the world. He wants me to be as wise as, something as a dove and as something as a serpent, you know what I'm saying? Like use wisdom as I walk and I have fellowship with people. So he does want me to be pure in heart, but he also says, you know, discern when you're around evil so you can make good decisions around evil. So like, even with, so it's just like being wise as, gentle as a dove or something and wise as a serpent so that like I don't have to like so be gullible like people say Christians are like a doormat where you can walk all over people. And that's why we use Psalm 91, right? So that I can hide in the Most High God and I can walk in the fruits of the Spirit, but yet also I can be shrewd. So if I notice that the things around me aren't of God, I can, you know, be polite and I can excuse myself from the situation and then walk accordingly. That's what we were just sharing in the car on the way over here. You know?
And what you first said was, you know, about being shrewd. That's exactly what Jesus was saying to this guy. Is he saw that he acted shrewdly? Which, what does that word mean?
Like clever,
Wisely.
wise,
It can mean
clever.
a little. It can
I
be
think
wise,
it's more
clever.
clever than
Yeah.
wise.
So
Yeah, I had to look in the dictionary because it's not a very common word for
Right, we
me.
use it a lot.
And it says it's smart, clever, bright, shrewd,
Yeah.
sharp, astute.
Just do-
So that was interesting.
Yeah.
I looked at a few different versions, and there's a lot of words that.
And the thing
that they
about
use.
being shrewd is the world honors people that way. The
Pardon?
world honors shrewd people. I mean, they do.
Yeah. In this case, should this guy be honored?
I don't think so. Should he?
No.
Well, I guess Jesus
Hey,
did.
do we honor dishonest people?
No.
You know, think about this.
Well, they do, this day and age, we honor a lot of this day.
Well,
We're seeing things we can't believe.
That's what I mean. The world honors shrewdness and cleverness. And
Yeah.
That's what I meant to say. Is the world, that's a big thing to the world.
But think about this. In the story, we think, well, he took the guy's debt and he made it lower. And he's doing it to help himself. He's making friends because he knows he's gonna get fired. And he wants a place to land, and that guy has a nice house. So I'm gonna take care of him a little better than this guy. But he's using what was put in his care. And that was, apparently he's an accountant, right? Taking care of the master's finances. But listen to this. It says that Jesus told his disciples that there was a rich man who was accused of wasting his possessions. This wasn't the first time he had done it. This is the way he was operating. And when he realized he was going to get fired, he was making plans for his future. And that works. What he did works in this world.
Well, it happens all the time.
Right. What he did works in this world, or maybe the better way to say it is in this life.
Right.
Now think of the other parables that we just looked at. The rich fool. You fool. You can keep everything you've earned in that barn, but when you die,
It's staying
you are
there.
spiritually poor.
It's staying in the barn.
You know, and think what this guy is.
Culturally, shrewdness was culturally honored here. It was considered a smart, wise thing to do, and the Pharisees, being lovers of money, honored that as well. And so
Yeah.
it held an important place in social status then.
I
Well, I guess
looked-
now too.
I looked at the complete Jewish Bible, and it says, "For the worldly have more sekel," is the word that's used in there. Of course, that's a word we don't know, so you have to look at it. They have more sekel than those who have received the light in dealing with their own kind of people. Well, that's an interesting way. Jesus tagged that on to the end of there, at verse 8, the last verse of that parable. And he's clearly talking about those in the world when he said that. Then basically he says, as compared to those in the light. Think back to the judge, the unjust judge, and the widow that went to him, and God compared himself. Was he comparing himself to an unjust judge? No, he was contrasting.
Right.
You know, the parable was a contrast, so that he was. The unjudged gave the lady what she wanted in the end, but it wasn't for the right reasons. It was like, leave me alone, you're bugging me. Yeah. And God, when we seek God and go to God, you know, in that same way, continually, He does it because He loves us and because He cares for
And He's
us.
working something in us when we do that.
Yeah. So when this parable is sort of like one of those. That statement that God commended that unjust man has always bothered me, but He did it in the contrast, so that we would understand that people in the world work in that way sometimes. They get away with it in this life, but He's just like that. He could have said in this parable too, that rich foolish accountant. Because when in the end He's going to be spiritually poor.
Well, and to your point, at the end of verse 8, he's saying people work harder to do what they can with money than people work harder to do what they can to promote the kingdom of God.
Right.
And in the world, in that context, how do we use money? To better ourselves, right? To
Right.
better our future.
Right.
And
And how did people in the light use money to further the kingdom?
right. That's what we've seen in these other parables. And we're going to tie that in a little bit. Even with the parable of the sheep and goats that we looked at last week. But in verse 8, don't forget that he says, in the world, for the worldly have more shrewdness than those who have received the light. Okay, and it's shrewdness in the way they use it. The way they use what's in their possession to further themselves, to prepare for their future. And as we've been seeing, how do the people of the light that is mentioned there, how do they do that?
People of the light are not putting forth, they're not investing in this world, they're investing in the other world.
Okay. We remember the theme of what we've been talking about in all those parables. True riches, right? Treasure in heaven. That's one of the things that when I read that article from the Jesus films, when I said taking care of yourself, it's like, you know what? Jesus taught exactly opposite of that. He said, go do what?
Sell everything
What you have, give it to the poor and the needy,
and follow it.
and then you will what?
Never just,
Then you will have treasure in heaven. He was always teaching of take the value of money that you know, that you understand, and this is how it works in the kingdom. And he just used that as an example. But in the kingdom, what brings true wealth is giving to others. Sheep and goats, how do you do that?
You're testing us today.
We just did that last week.
I know.
How did it end? He said, he separated them on the right and the left, and he said, nobody can tell me? What did the faithful do
The faithful.
to get to be rewarded? What did the faithful do? They took care of the poor.
They
Yeah, they did what he said. They obeyed what he had said. Some of them, they didn't even realize, what did we do? When did we feed you?
Oh, right.
And he said, when you did it to the least of my brothers, when you took care of the poor and the needy, you did that to me. And
Oh, that's the difference of the mindset of the world and the mindset of.
it's exactly what Jesus is trying to point out in
Yes,
these
it's their
parables
mindset.
about money.
The world takes care of themselves, and the mindset of Christ and of Christians is to take care of the needy. Those
He's
who-
saying, you see what this guy did, and it wasn't right, but he took care of himself.
Clever.
For the alignment that he was choosing, he did wisely.
So what's the contrast that we should take away from that? What's the contrast? Jesus says, do that as Christians. You know, not being dishonest
Right.
to make gain, but take what is in your possession, what you have been given as to be steward of, and we have seen that everybody has something. It's been given to us according to our abilities. He says, take that, and you do what that guy did. You better your future. And we'll understand that a little bit more in these next verses. Let's go ahead and read the next verses. Very important verses. Verse 9.
And I
I'm
say,
going to stop at 15, 9 to 15.
9 to 15. And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of mammon, of unrighteousness, that when you fall, they may receive you into everlasting habitations.
He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much, and he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much.
So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches?
True riches.
And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own?
No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth.
Now the Pharisee who were lovers of money were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him.
But he said to them, you are the ones who justify yourself before people, but God knows your heart. For what is prized among men is detestable in God's sight.
And I included those last few verses to show that Jesus was still dealing with Pharisees. We see that in half the parables or more. And then that very last line, what is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. And we've talked about that the last couple of weeks in these parables, that what we think is valuable in this world, that's not what is really valuable. Jesus continually talked about true wealth or treasure in heaven. True riches is what he says here. And the point is that when we believe that handling your finances, your money, your wealth in that way to help others, when we believe that really is true wealth, riches in heaven, we will do it. That guy in his situation, dishonesty and all, he was using what he had there to take care of his future, and it was going to be a short future. He's going to be like the rich fool. But the thing that we should draw away from that is that, we're given so much. Everything that we have has been given to us by God. And we are stewards of it. And if we use that correctly, what will we be doing? We will be doing that. Let's turn back to Matthew 25 for just a minute.
And we're feeding him, we'll be clothing him, we'll be...
This is in verse 31, it's the parable of the sheep and goats. And when we saw that's when Jesus came back to earth, and he's on his throne in glory, So, we're looking like around the judgment time. And he's separating the sheep and the goats. And it says, I want to go to verse 34. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." And the righteous will answer him. I mean, think of it yourself. When did you do that? When did you clothe Jesus? When did you visit him in prison? He says, "You did that?" The righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you? Or thirsty and give you clothes? When did we see you in prison and minister to you?" He says, when you go to verse 40, the king will reply, "I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." And when we believe in our hearts that when we do that thing, that an act of love to someone that's down and out, when we believe that we're really doing that for Jesus, what will be our response? We'll be looking for more opportunities like that.
Find somebody else I can help.
We will be looking for.
Who's next?
And I really believe that that's what the thrust of this parable is.
Yeah.
It's to help us to get our mind right. Quit thinking in natural terms and think in terms of true wealth. You know, and a verse we might not get to, I'm going to read it right now. It's very into my notes. Revelations 22:12. "Look, I am coming soon. My reward is with me, and I will give to each person according to what they have done." And that's what we're seeing in this parable in verse 25.
The picture of the
Chapter
sheep.
25 of Matthew.
The sheep from the sheep and the goats paints that picture of humility and humble service. And then we think of it, what he's talking about here, he's talking in front of the Pharisees who viewed prosperity and wealth as a symbol of God's blessing that required no action on their part, but put them in this position of being above everybody else and judging people on what they do. And then I thought it was interesting in verse 3, where the manager says to himself, "What shall I do, since my master's taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, I'm ashamed to beg." So there's that pride. But it's interesting that not once does he say anything about just going and asking forgiveness. He makes it about what he's going to do. Makes it about not humbling himself.
What I can do.
And
Right.
that was exactly the same way with the rich fool.
Exactly.
He never considered the spiritual.
They never considered the spiritual, and they never considered humbling themselves.
Because they're worldly minded.
Exactly. And that's exactly the Pharisees that he was addressing here had that heart, that same mindset. I just really thought it was neat how that wrapped together with the sheep and the goats. And we
Yeah.
see that picture of humility here that he just didn't have by saying, "I'll consider forgiveness."
It's
We need to get our nature. If we're in Christ, our nature should be to help, to do, to give. These are things it should be.
And in this response, or in the sort of the explanation that follows that parable, the verses 9, there's so much stuff there. Verse 9 is a really key verse. And far away from my notes. But in verse 9, the first part of that, it says, "I tell you." Jesus, this is the words of Jesus. He says, I'm telling you. Use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself. Not like that unjust man. Not like worldly men, but as children of light. I mean, you can see that contrast in the verse. So use what you have to, I mean, you're doing it for Christ when you do that. It's a credit to you as service in the kingdom. In 3 or 4 places it says true wealth, lay up treasure in heaven by doing these things.
Can I read my version
Yep.
of verse 9? Here's the lesson. Use your worldly resources to benefit others and make friends. Then when your possessions are gone, they will welcome you to an eternal home. I
Interesting.
like how that said worldly
Yeah.
resources.
And that also, I think in the NIV it says, and then you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings.
Mhm.
So back to the sheep and goats.
Mhm.
What happened there? Exactly this.
Mhm.
Exactly this. In the second half of that, well, worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself. It sounds an awful lot like selling what you have,
Mhm.
or taking that wealth and helping the poor, which is our calling. Jesus, in many places, said to do that. The Jesus film says, take care of yourself. Well, we know we have to do that naturally. But what did Jesus teach? Right there, where he said, sell what you have. And I think this was with the rich ruler, the rich young ruler. He said, I've kept all the commandments. Jesus said, there's one thing you lack. Go sell everything you have and give to the poor and to the needy. And then you will have treasure in heaven, he said. And you know what comes right after that? He didn't say, but keep a little to worry for yourself,
Store up for
to worry about
retirement.
yourself. He didn't say that. Actually, what he said was, don't worry about
Exactly.
how you're going to be taken care of. I'll take care of that. Look at the birds of the air.
Yeah.
Look at the flowers of the field. That's what came after that. And it's amazing how all of these parables that we've talked about money, how they've been right around that teaching. Right, it was right before or right after that teaching. He's trying to get us to understand what is really important.
Yeah,
You
it's
can't-
interesting that he doesn't say, when he's talking about in verse 9, the wealth of unrighteousness, he doesn't say if it fails, he says when.
Right.
He
Yeah.
reminds us
When
it's
your
going to
possessions are
fail.
gone, yeah.
Yeah, in that guy's situation for sure, because he was the one that the master was the one that was actually going to fire him. He was just giving him a chance to explain what he was going to do.
And the whole thing here is covetousness is the biggest thing. That's one of the commandments that we tend to forget nowadays. And everything in our society is built on covetousness. You want a bigger car, you want a fancier car, you want best cell phone, it's built on having the best. And that's not, this world is not, we're not supposed to be after the best. The best is what's the world to come.
Well, and that's the whole, look at marketing in general. You look at a car commercial, generally speaking, they're showing people envious of their neighbor's car.
Right.
Yeah.
Envious of their neighbor's phone, their friend's phone. It's built on envy.
Yeah.
The whole commercial system is really built on that.
Isn't it like with Mary pouring the oil on Jesus' feet too? Because when she was doing it because she knew the value of Jesus, but when Judas
True.
looked at the
Yeah.
money, he looked at it in terms of you're wasting it,
Yeah, some of the disciples looked at it that way
Mhm.
and expressed that. I think it was Judas, right?
Yeah, he was
And
one
what
of
did
them.
what was Judas's
He was a
job?
treasurer of the disciples' crew.
Maybe he was the guy in this story.
One thing that you just said about the manager gonna fire this guy. It's like the manager knew what this guy was doing all along, I believe.
He had heard reports.
And that's how God is. He knows your heart. You know, he knows your intention. He knows the intention of your heart and why you do things and why you don't do things. And so I just thought about how the manager knew this guy was up to no good.
Yeah, I mean,
But he still let him
ultimately,
be his,
ultimately, when you break it down, in the spiritual understanding, the master would be God, and he
always gives you a chance to
he doesn't hear the
repent.
accusations. He knows,
Right.
you know, he sees hearts, and we see that in verse 14.
And I believe he always gives you a chance to repent. And what are you gonna do
Yes.
with that chance? And what did this guy do with his chance to repent? He did. He didn't forgive.
Yeah, it's a reference to the judgment. He's calling him to give an account of his management, but also letting him know that what you had is taken. He doesn't say it says for you can no longer be manager. The decision is already made,
Yeah,
but he still calls him to make that account.
yeah, that's interesting. And then in the end of verse 9, it says, so when it is gone, when it fails, that money, and it was going to, because he was going to be fired, in the verse 9, when Jesus is explaining that, the spiritual significance of it, it was for us. Let me read the whole verse. Oh, I got it right here, actually. I'm going to read it in a couple different versions. I think I had it. Well, I tell you the truth, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself. So when that wealth is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Sounds awful like heaven, doesn't it? That's eternal home.
Right.
I had picked some verses out there, but I don't see them. I'm way away from my notes.
I think every parable has one thing in common. It's where is your focus?
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're not with God, and if it's you do things for people out of their glory or them thanking you and all this other stuff, it's where is your heart?
And how did Jesus focus that? That what you're expressing right there. I mean, Jesus said it directly when he was talking about the Pharisees. Verse 14, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your hearts. What is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. And we've said that, over the last few parables, that what is right in man's eyes is not the way God looks at it. It's different. But in the verse before that, 13, no servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And so he focuses it directly. It's, you can focus on spiritual principles, or you can live your life for this world. And we saw how the rich fool did that. But he makes it direct. It's, money's great in this life, it do you nothing in the next life.
Well, I think a lot of people, and even Christians too, they find a sense of security in money. I mean, you need money to live. You need money. It's a need, a worldly need. But it's not our security. That's not where we find it. Once we understand that is not where our security is. Our security is in God. He's promised to take care of us. He will take care of us. He's our not only security in this life, He's our eternal security.
That's what I was going to say.
And once we can get that through our heads, the way we look at money will completely change.
See, one thing that we're taught in this world is to work for retirement.
And
Christ never said anything about a retirement in this world.
Never.
It's true. You see him saying, look, you gotta have at least $500,000 in your
For a
bank,
day.
and if, yeah, or you can't retire properly. And that's not what Christ doesn't say, we aren't supposed to be working for retirement. That was started by our money people, because they wanted to use our money. And it wasn't started for our benefit,
Correct.
because most of us don't get to appreciate most of us.
Some people,
Well, it's a difference between working to or toward something, or working for, or serving for something, and that's why I think they use that term slave here, but we're taught to work toward, to your point, work toward retirement, work for this and work for that. And this is actually not talking about working toward anything, it's about what do you serve.
Right, it's about doing what he said.
right.
It's about focusing not on accumulating earthly wealth, but, you know, putting it in the kingdom,
Right.
putting it in his service. Here's the other two versions I wanted to read. This is the complete Jewish Bible again. It was interesting. Now, verse 9, now what I say to you is this: use worldly wealth to make friends for yourself, so that when that money gives out, you may be welcomed into the eternal home. The eternal is in most of the versions. And here's what it says in the sheep and goats. When he separates the people to his right and to his left, he said, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. Sounds a lot like heaven, don't it? It's the spiritual focus. You know, get your eyes off, you know, the earthly things and look to the spiritual things. And there's so much more. Let me just quickly do verse 10, just another minute here, I think. But the parable is about being a good steward of the wealth that is put in our care. And who is faithful with little will be given much. How often have we seen that? Whoever has will be given more. Who doesn't have will, even when he thinks he has, will be taken away. Whoever doesn't have, this is how we should understand that. Whoever doesn't have in the spiritual true wealth, even what they think they have, won't be there. There's just so much in that really helps us understand how we should look at that parable and understand it. He's not commending an unjust man for being unjust. But he's comparing that to how, you know, that man in his environment did what we should do in our environment. And that's the spiritual, in our spiritual lives. Would you pray? Dismiss us.
Father, thank you for this time to delve into your word and to learn more about you and your expectations for us. Father, bless us as we go into service this morning. Open our hearts and let us hear you. We ask that you would cheers our worship as we go into worship. Thank you for this time.